Good afternoon, and welcome to Philosophy 150, Symbolic Logic. My name is Mark Phelan, and I'll be your guide this term to learning formal logic. Logic is the study of arguments in order to sort the good ones from the bad ones. Arguments, in the sense in which we're talking about them in logic, are not like shouting matches between co-hosts on MSNBC or Fox News. Instead, arguments are structured reasons that someone might give you for accepting a conclusion. You might see arguments like this in your local newspaper, from a lawyer in a trial, or, of course, in philosophy papers. In order to evaluate which arguments are good and which arguments are bad, we're going to need to develop a formal language. And indeed, most of our time this term will be spent developing this formal language and learning how to use it. Let's turn to the PowerPoint to get a better sense of what a formal language is.
Okay. Welcome to the PowerPoint. To get a sense of artificial languages, we're first going to need to contrast them with natural languages. So what are natural languages? Let's start by just enumerating some of them. Well, natural languages would include things like English, Arabic, or Tagalog. Artificial languages, on the other hand, might include the language of set theory, the programming language of C, or first-order logic. Natural languages arose haphazardly for the specific purpose of efficient information exchange among humans. So, in effect, these natural languages were crafted to achieve two desirable goals that humans wanted. They wanted to communicate a lot of information, and they wanted to do this as efficiently as possible. So how do they do this? Well, natural languages do this by exploiting common knowledge about the pattern of human thoughts. And now you might ask, well, how do I know what the pattern is of what other people are thinking? And the answer to that is, I know the pattern of human thoughts because I am human. I have experience with other people, and I can draw the assumption that other human minds tend to work like my own. Okay, so how does a natural language exploit our common knowledge about the pattern of human thought to give us a great deal of information efficiently? Well, here's one example of a language doing this in action. Okay, so suppose you're walking down College Avenue. I know it reminds us of simpler times, but suppose you're walking down College Avenue when someone walks up to you and says, "Can you recommend a good restaurant?" Well, if someone asks you this, you are not going to recommend a restaurant that opens at 5 p.m. when it's 10 after 12, nor are you going to recommend a restaurant in Tokyo, Japan. Why aren't you going to do these two things? He just asked for a restaurant. It could be a good restaurant in Japan that opens at 5 p.m. Why aren't you going to tell him that? Well, the reason is because you infer that if a person is asking for a restaurant recommendation at noon in Appleton, they are really asking for a recommendation of where to eat at noon in Appleton. But none of those details were explicitly stated. And the reason they weren't is because they didn't have to be, because you're both human. And you know how human minds tend to work. Here's another example of efficient information exchange in a natural language. Here's a fact. My friend Aaron has 2 sons. Okay, now I'm going to ask you this question, and answer it yourself in your head. Does Professor Phelan's friend, Aaron, have 3 sons? Here's your answers. Yes, no, or you're not sure. Think how you would answer this. I suspect many of you said, yes, Professor Phelan's friend, Aaron, said, no, Professor Phelan's friend, Aaron, does not have 3 sons. And your assumptions ran something like this. Since Aaron is his friend, he must know about her kids. Typically, people supply the most specific information they have access to. And it would be unspecific to point out that she has 2 sons when she has some number of sons more than 2. So he must mean Aaron has 2 and only 2 sons. But in fact, this is false. My friend Aaron has 3 sons. This sentence, though, my friend Aaron has 2 sons, remains true, and it is a fact. So you were led astray from a true statement to drawing some false assumptions because of the efficient exchange that natural language provided. So there are certain trade-offs inherent in natural languages. Natural languages are made for human minds, so they're easy for humans to learn and to use effectively. However, this is a two-edged sword. Natural languages are made for human minds, so they're subject to specific shortcomings related to the nature of these evolved organs, including they can rely on contextual cues in order to determine meaning. They are perception-based and not designed for abstract reasoning. And they're shaped to deal with specific ancestral environments and situations, not with abstract relations and situations. Furthermore, they're aimed at getting things right most of the time, not absolutely right, to a high level of certitude.
Okay, let's consider one of our proofs. So let's take the following proof. So in this proof, we are given one premise. And that premise is, if A, then if B, then C. And now our goal here is to derive the conclusion, if A and B, then C. All right, so how are we going to do that? Well, notice first of all that our goal is itself a conditional statement. So perhaps the right approach here is to try conditional introduction. And how do we do a conditional introduction? Well, what we do first of all is we assume the antecedent of the conditional. Oops, sorry about that. So we're going to assume the antecedent of the conditional. And so to do that, we're going to draw in a new proof line here. And we're going to put, I did it again, we're going to put our second step as the assumption of the antecedent of this conditional. So we're going to assume A and B. And we're doing this again for purposes of a conditional introduction. And we're going to try to show that if A and B is true in a context where this premise is true, then C will follow from that. So our next step is to think about how we're going to get C. And to do that, we know that if we have A, then we can derive if B, then C. And if we have B, then we can get C. So let's get A. That's readily available to us from conjunction elimination of 2. And now, if A is the case, we can derive if B, then C from conditional elimination of 1 and 3. Now, again, we can derive B from our conditional. So we will for our conjunctive statements, we're again going to use conjunction elimination to derive B here from step 2. Now, at step 6, we can derive C from another use of conditional elimination from 4 and 5. And now, we have derived, or we have shown that C follows from A and B. So, in other words, we've shown that our conditional holds in the case where our premise holds. In other words, if our premise is true, then the following conditional statement, if A and B, then C, follows via conditional introduction from 2 to 6. And that's it. Okay, let's take a look at this proof to see how our negation elimination rule works. So, as you can see, our goal in this proof is to derive D. And we're given 2 premises, Z and K, or K and M, and if K, then D. So, as we can see, D is a consequence of our conditional stated at premise 2, if K, then D. So if we can just get K, we'll be able to derive D. And furthermore, K seems to be a consequence of either of the disjuncts in our first premise. So maybe a good approach here is to start out by trying to assume that it's not the case that K for a negation elimination. So let's do that. We'll start a subproof here. Not sure how long that's going to go, so we'll just leave that line indeterminate. And we'll start with our assumption that it's not the case that K. And now, as the book tells us, we want to specify what we're trying to do by assuming not K. And so what we want to do here is we're doing this for purposes of negation elimination. Okay, so we have not K. Where do we go from here? Well, notice if we could show that on the assumption of not K, one of these disjuncts was false, then we would be able to derive the other. Okay? So what we're going to do at this point is a little bit tricky, but what we're going to do is we're going to assume that one of these disjuncts is true. And we're going to do this for purposes of negation introduction. So what we're going to do is we're going to suppose that Z and K is true, and this time it's for negation introduction. Okay, so if Z and K were true, then we would be able to derive from that K via our conjunction elimination rule. And if we have K, then we would have a contradiction with not K. And we can make that clear just by reiterating not K above. So we'll do that, just citing our rule R for reiteration and premise 3. Oh, I left off the premise here before. Let's go ahead and add that in. Okay, so we have a contradiction here. And we know that once we derive a contradiction, our negation introduction rule tells us that we can introduce the negation of whatever that step was that led us to this contradiction. And we do that outside of the subproof. So here at step 7, we're going to assert that it's not the case that Z and K. And we do that via negation introduction, right? Remember that was the rule we specified here. So negation introduction, and we're going to cite 4 through 5 and 4 through 6. In other words, we're showing that once we assumed Z and K, we were able to derive K, and given that it's occurring in this larger context, we were able also to derive not K. And that resulted in a contradiction, so we have to toss out this guy, Z and K, and that's going to give us, it's not the case that Z and K. Now, we're still in this subproof, so let's extend that line a little bit further. And so, we have, it's not the case that Z and K, and don't forget we have this disjunction up above. So at this point we're going to be able to assert K and M via our disjunction elimination rule, and we're just going to cite 1 and 7 for that. Because if we have a disjunction, we know that one of the disjuncts must be true in order to make that true, and we have shown that K and M is not true. Okay, so at this point we now have K and M. At 9 we can derive K, right? So we get K from conjunction elimination of 8. And now we have a contradiction again. We have K and not K. So we can demonstrate that contradiction by again reiterating step 3. So we'll just reiterate that. And then we are now able to assert the opposite of our negated assumption made at step 3. So we're able to assert the opposite of that thing. We've done what we wanted here, so we assert K, and we do that using negation elimination. And our negation elimination, similarly to our negation introduction rule, is going to start from the assumption that started this subproof, which will be 3, and it's going to run through 9, showing that K follows from that thing. And also, it's going to show from 3 to 10 that not K follows. In other words, we have a contradiction demonstrated here at the end of the proof. Now, at this point, it's very straightforward. We can derive d via conditional elimination from step 2 and step 11.